Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an online software for coaches and trainers, and I've continued to hear great things about the TeamBuildr platform. If you're looking for either an in-house training portal for your training groups or an online training hub, be sure to check out the TeamBuildr training software. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for being here, and I'm excited to bring on our guests, Matt Boulé and Jeff Moyer. Matt Boulé is an osteopath and a posturologist. He's educated in functional neurology, muscle activation techniques, and he's the founder of the IP Institute. Jeff Moyer has been a multi-time guest on this show. I've also had the good fortune of being able to travel to Pittsburgh. So once I moved to Ohio, I was able to make a little trip to Pittsburgh and meet Jeff at his gym. It was an awesome experience. Jeff has a wide-ranging expertise, including Soviet training systems, motor learning and skill acquisition, as well as the visual and neurological components that feed into athleticism and good athletic movement. There are a number of lenses that we can use to assess and train human performance. We have the muscular end of things. We have the connective tissue, tendons, and the fascial end. We have biomechanics and motor learning. And we also have the neurological lens. And we have a lot of things that can give us a lot of information about why an athlete moves in the way that they do. And so this is what Jeff and Matt will be unpacking today. They'll be talking about the pyramid of learning and the order of things that they look at on the level of neurological pieces of the human movement equation, and then with some training implications. So it was great talking to these guys. We will hit the ground running with the episode. And if you want to learn more and see some videos related to some of the material, especially towards the end of the episode, what we'll be talking about, you can check out these show notes on justflysports.com. All right, let's get to episode 383 here with Matt Boulé and Jeff Moyer. I do want to really center a lot around what Jeff said, is those sensory gateways, the vision, the soles of the feet. I think so many of us get clients, individuals, athletes in. I know for me, a lot of times, and my knowledge of what you guys are going to be getting into is very base level. All I notice is I'm just like, I know something is not right here, like vestibularly, vision-wise. I don't know how to test it. I just know something is off, and it doesn't go into any of my other testing buckets. And I think that the main thing I do have is the soles and the skins of the feet. I do a lot of stuff there, but that's the one piece. And so maybe tell me a little bit more about the pyramid of learning, like from an inside out perspective. What are these main pieces neurologically that set an individual up to be a good mover, adaptable, to be able to move without restriction in their environment?
I'll let Jeff answer that one. He's more than
okay.
capable.
He's been ready to go. Yeah, let's do it.
It's all good. Well, the pyramid of learning came from Williams and Schnellenberg, who were educational psychiatrists. Matt, is that correct?
Yeah, educational therapists. Yeah,
therapists. Sorry, and they mapped out the blueprints, essentially, of how the brain and the nervous system is developed from birth. So 1 or 2 years old, or to high level academics. And so the pyramid of learning, I don't have a picture with me right now, but it is kind of, again, we all, whether it's you or Matt or me, our brain developed in similar patterns and similar ways from birth, from childhood. And the pyramid does an excellent job of showing the stages. And I couldn't help but think, while you guys were talking about handedness and AIS and all the postural stuff, of, well, one of the things at the very base of the pyramid is, well, depending on which pyramid you look at, it's a central nervous system, or some people will put the pyramid of reflexes there. And I couldn't help but think the sided-ness and all this stuff, in how you couldn't find necessarily correlations with the legs and stuff. Well, also, to me, from what I've seen, is how the child is developed. How did they crawl? What reflexes do they still possibly have? So Matt can get into it a little bit better, but you'll find athletes that are really tight left glutes, right? Really tight left glute. It's always their left, even though they're right-handed, right-footed. Regardless of what sport, the left glute is really tight. Well, if you happen to have, we're at that age now where our parents have videos of kids crawling. Not so much when we were kids, get the big ass VHS recorder out. But you can see now when you watch those old videos, and Joel, I'm sure you can, looking back at your kids, of how they crawled. I have this one girl, for instance, she's 17 years old, track athlete, senior in high school. She's been on Ritalin since 14. She has really bad reading issues. and she said she never crawled, and
Mm-hmm.
so she sent me a video of what she did. I don't know if I think I sent it to you guys, of her just doing this butt scoot.
Oh yeah,
And she
yeah.
did a butt scoot,
Bump
and her
shuffle.
leg yeah, she did this weird butt scoot, and like no one said it was wrong. You know, it's not anyone's fault that she was doing this, but like that's not correct. That, you know, that creeping pattern is not correct, and you know she's got some sidedness now due to that, and you can see that in kids if you watch them how they crawl and stuff, whether it's one leg works better than the other, because that's where tone is first set and developed, is from childhood and through those reflexes. And so for me, I start, if I see patterns. So for instance, I give you another quick case study, and then Matt can give you a better explanation. College football player came in. We're going through his history of injuries, all left-sided injuries. Um, he has limited range of motion in his hips for external internal rotation, but his mom said he was a W sitter when he was a kid, and he was a toe walker. Well, right there, boom, that in my head says he has a TLR, a tonic lateral rhinthai reflex when he was a kid. Oh shit, there goes my picture behind my head. And right there, I knew he had primitive reflexes that was probably still retained. And so I'm not going to get those things to move until we start addressing the underlying issue, which was the primitive reflex. And that's where we start at the base of the pyramid. And then Matt, Matt can go through more of connecting the dots. But for me, that pyramid has just been so helpful to like, okay, Joe, we've done, I believe, a podcast on vision training, sports vision training. And, I still attest and use and love Slow the Game Down and what they've taught me and what the late Dr. Bill Hartman taught me. But I wasn't batting 1,000. I couldn't fix all these visual issues that I was seeing. Some kids, I was just told that just couldn't get stereostopsis. They couldn't get binocularity, And then once I started learning what Matt was teaching and IP and started learning the pyramid, then I started addressing those things, and then boom, all this vision training started getting so much better, without necessarily even directly doing vision training. And so for me, it's been the pyramid is the answer to a lot of issues that we see with kids who are labeled with learning things, or kids who have, for lack of a better phrase, and I apologize, motor morons, that we work with that just can't figure out where their ass or their elbow is. For me, this pyramid has been a great guide for that, and Matt's been my teacher for that.
And the pyramid comes from the U.S., so there you go. It's true. I was asked to do a symposium about 10 years ago about the work that I did, and I was on Google trying to figure out like what kind of a visual could I present to the crowd. It was all strength coaches. It was in Montreal. There was about 100 of them. And this is still very new to a lot of people. But 10 years ago, presenting this in Montreal, this was completely new. Like no one had an idea. Again, mostly developed in Europe. But that's it. So, and then I came across this learning pyramid from Williams and Schellenberger. And I thought, okay, these two ergotherapists aren't even involved in sports performance because they're involved in learning and academic issues. But my gosh, it's the same brain. And if you're able to each stage of the pyramid has some competencies that you literally have to learn, and you build on these competencies from simple to more complex, from isolated to more integrated. And as you do that, you integrate the primitive reflexes that Jeff was speaking about. You integrate them in the order that you need to integrate them, because in medicine, it's quite known that for us to be able to move the way we want, we have to integrate these primitive reflexes. And yeah, so that's the work that we do. And when we do that, we give people more access to recruiting muscles, and that recruitment, the access to the tissues, is actually what then allows you to develop any quality, whether it's, power, strength, endurance, flexibility, hypertrophy. So it's pretty much that simple. It's just understanding how we develop and making sure that we have access to our 600 muscles with the one brain that we have. Most people don't. Most people have a brain, they don't have access to all 600 muscles.
So speaking of the pyramid, I really want to approach this from, if we look at like most pyramids have a layer of depth to them. Like the entry to the pyramid is very simple. Everyone can understand it. And then as you go up, you have to have and experience the layers before it. So I think, and even for my own sake here, I definitely want to kind of work with more of the entry level stuff. But one thing I really, and Jeff, you had said it, I think this is something that my brain instantly goes to. is there's athletes who just aren't coordinated. Are they just not, here's my fingers, air quotes, not coordinated? They're just not a good mover. And I will say there are some athletes who are just exceptionally skilled, like end of story, I believe, like who just have it in their, it's almost like in the line of genes to, like the Pele, the Michael Jordan, like they're just skilled movers. But how do you differentiate between maybe just not being that good at sports in general? Maybe, maybe chess or music is more your thing, right? Like that's probably connected too. Please tell me how. But how do you, what are some red flags that there are like reflexes, vision, vestibular issues that are holding someone back from their movement ability? Like someone is uncoordinated. You ask them to skip or do basic skips or movement in the gym, and they're just not good at it. What are some tripwires to say, okay, there is something neurological going on here that we actually can do something about? They're not just, oh, that kid's just a motor moron, or whatever you said, whatever your term is. Hopefully it's a little bit nicer than that. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. I'm just curious with some basics, because I think a lot of coaches would be in that position, because we get a lot of kids who have different levels of discoordination and in different ways. And so what are some ways we can go about looking into that?
Well, I'll tell you what I look for, and then Matt can get into it with the high level athletes he works with. But like, and it's not just athletes, because I work with adults too. But I see, but athletes that are people that struggle mirroring what I'm trying to do. So if they're standing across from me and I hold up my right hand, they hold up their left hand, right? They struggle with the right and left there. People that just generally struggle knowing their right from the left. I can't tell you the amount. I would definitely say it's probably over 20% of my athletes that don't know the right from their left. Just that. So not knowing right from left, mirroring what I do, taking instruction. Athletes that kind of just like have this blank stare when you're talking, and you have to. Again, I understand there's different ways to learn. There's visual, auditory, this and that. But the athletes that really need their hands on, and you need to do it for them. And then not only that, you have to do it for them multiple times. They can't remember what they did yesterday. They can't remember what they did an hour ago. It's those athletes that come in and it's almost like a new session every day, but you've been doing the same things. Athletes that when you're cueing them, they don't seem to know where they are, right? So Matt can get into the breakdown of coordination, right? So we use that phrase motor moron, but again, for lack of a better phrase, but there's elements of what goes into coordination, proprioception being one of them, but there's conscious and unconscious proprioception that we can get into. And so do they even know where their body is in space? Yeah, I know my foot's on the ground, but can I feel it? Can you show me that you can feel your foot? And that goes for coordination, but that also goes for athletes that have chronic injuries, constantly rolling their ankle. I'm willing to bet they're losing sensitivity of their foot, and that's also something playing into it. And I've tested that both with what I've learned from Matt and the 2-point discrimination test. I'll touch their toes, and they have no idea what toes I touched. They couldn't tell you what toes I touched, and they laugh about it because it's almost silly that they should know what toes I touched. And athletes that come with one-sidedness is a sign of something to me. All left shoulders always tight, left hips always tight, my left ankle's always messed up. One-sidedness is something that I just had another man. I got a whole bunch. I'm going to do an article on it for you, Joel. I promise. I already ran it through Matt, but that's just some of what I got. Matt, what else you got, buddy?
Dude, that was like so I guess the conclusion to what all the different points that Jeff brought up is that in every one of those cases, if the individual has a hard time perceiving their right and their left, they're obviously going to have a hard time projecting themselves in the environment. So for sports, that's huge. And if you have a difficulty feeling one foot versus the other, that's actually going to be correlated with an imbalance in posture. So typically the side that we don't connect with as well is the side where we have a tilt. So you assess someone in posture, you put your hands on their pelvis, and if the right side of the pelvis is lower, I'm a bit of a gambler. I'm willing to bet a decent amount that would be the side where they have less sensitivity. That's the side they're going to feel like they don't have as much control over. If they use both legs in the same role, they're going to find like that's the leg that gives out before the other one. Running's a good example. They're going to be shifting to the opposite leg if they squat and if they deadlift, whether it's heavy or light. So there's interesting correlations to make there that are the significant correlations, I'm going to say, to be safe, between these imbalances in posture and the imbalances in movement. And Jeff gave very good examples of all that.
I just remembered a couple others. Okay, sorry. So the one Matt always talked about in the IP courses, the athletes, when they bench press, they always look at one hand, right? They're always looking, and they don't know why they're doing it. You know, they're going down, and then for some reason their head just always goes to the right. Another one is the athletes for me, and I know the phrase I learned from Chris Corfus a while ago with RPR and stuff, the neck drivers, right? To me, I have not tested thousands of athletes, but the athletes that are neck drivers, when they bench press or they struggle putting their head down on the floor, or they're just the ones that are always doing this, are the ones that have reflexes pertaining to the head with the asymmetric platonic neck reflex, the STNR, the TLR reflexes, and then eye contact. The athletes that can't make contact with me. I mean, one of the first things I've taught, whether it was through Matt or through Malilo, is if they struggle making eye contact, they can't look at you, then there's something right away going on.
Yeah. Maybe just to kind of pare this down to like, I think it's, you know, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different types of athletes and things. I'd love to actually, maybe we can start a little bit with the eye contact piece, just because I'm sure that's something that it's not just in the physical training session. It's probably something they do in social settings, in school. There's probably a lot of interrelationships there. So I'm sure psychologically too, there's psychological reasons why someone might not want to make eye contact, but I think that's a big thing in the coaching space that's very important, no matter who you are, sport coach, strength coach, therapist. Tell me a little bit more about that as it pertains to the neurological state, and then things that, if you can do anything about it in the scope of whatever practice you're working with, how you could look at that.
There's an order in which we develop the capacity we have to put our eyes on something or someone. What comes very naturally, what comes first, is peripheral vision. So in infancy, a child is going to become competent at looking to the right and to the left much before they become decent at looking directly in front of them. And so if you look at the maturation of the system, then as Jeff points out, if a kid who's not a kid anymore, but maybe a teenager, or even like maybe they're 6-7 years old, and if they have a hard time looking at you when you're close to them, it's because that's, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's actually quite recent. If you look at humans versus species that came before us, the very fact that our eyes are in front of our head, we take that for granted because it's been like that for 7 million years. But we've evolved from species in the water. And if you look at just your common fish, I mean, they basically have eyes on the sides of their head. So, we really are the resultant of bacteria that was there 4 billion years ago. And I think when we keep that in mind, it's easier to understand why we're able to do certain things and why we wouldn't be so good at others. So the first thing that gives out when we're more fatigued, or if we have more stress, or if we just don't have all the competencies we're supposed to have that we acquire in infancy, we'll lose the capacity of looking at an object that's coming straight to our face. And the closer it gets to us, the harder it is to focus on it. Think about the repercussions in sports performance right there. That's just huge, because if your eyes don't coordinate well, it's even harder to think that you'll have good eye-hand coordination. And it's even harder to think you'll have good eye-foot coordination. So, so for us, that's, obviously at the core of the work that we do, it's our bias, but it's a bias based on just pure logic of the requirements that a human needs to have. So yes, in terms of socialization, as Jeff brought up, and I really like the point that he makes, because he's the first of my students who's ever mentioned that. And interestingly enough, we see it all the time. It's just not something I had ever paid attention to. But the capacity to look at someone in the eyes when they are close to you is definitely very evolved neurologically, and it's not the easiest thing to do.
I'd also go on the other side of that coin, and going back to the primitive reflexes, it could also mean that they have a Maro reflex or a fear paralysis reflex. And so you don't want to look at the thing that's there that scares you. And so if we have these two particular reflexes, which from my understanding are two of the earliest ones developed in utero, we have sympathetic nervous system that immediately kicks on and we're in fight or flight. So if we have this chronic Maro reflex on, their dream, everything that goes with heightened sympathetic activity, adrenals, fatigue, more things like that, start to burn out, and they can fatigue faster and things like that.
Gotcha. So, I mean, with the eye contact as well, I mean, I did mention it, and you mentioned with the fear reflex, but I mean, how do you, I think in a lot of situations, it's also something that is, it's conditioned, or it maybe it's come from a psychological piece. Like there's got to be psychological reasons that people aren't attuned to eye contact as well. I mean, or maybe these are interrelated. I know for me, for just personal experience, I started looking down a lot early after, I don't know, maybe I was like 4, 5, 6 years old, just not looking people in the eye anymore. And I think part of that was just, I wasn't like bullied hardcore, but I think, kids poke fun of me. I had a hard time just fitting in. I think that there was just pieces socially that caused me not to maintain eye contact. I do think for me it was more social. Of course, I'd be interested to be assessed on that. But yeah, I'm just curious, like neurological. How do you know something is neurological versus something that might just be conditioned? Like, coach says, hey, like eye contact before we start. This is conditioned, or just I think that a lot of things are multifaceted. I would just be curious on your thoughts with that.
So we know that the emotional system, how we feel, has a direct impact on how much stiffness we have in our muscles. When we go into a stress response, we don't choose to, but we tend to close down. I call it the Mike Tyson pathway, but it's really called the rubrospinal. So most people remember the Mike Tyson pathway, not so much the rubrospinal. But basically, that's your stress response. So you go into like a flexion mode for protection, and that can come purely from a stress that's emotional. But the highway does go in both directions. So if you build more resiliency in someone's capacity to contract muscles, they also get better at managing a stress that comes from the emotional side of things. But as you said, Joel, it's totally a bit of both. So I figure in the work that Jeff and I do, the only thing I'll say for myself, the only thing I'm really good at is just building resiliency in the person's system, so that I'll focus on that. And then chances are, if they come across a situation that's going to be more unpleasant, they might not react with as much stress building in their body. But it would be normal that if a tiger runs after them, that no matter how much resiliency I've built in them, they still have to figure if they're going to fight or if they're going to flight, and they'll still go into a stress response. And at that point in time, it's probably a good thing, because that's going to save their life. The issue is when people's bodies and minds go into a stress response when really the situation isn't that problematic. And I guess that's the bridge that we're trying to cross with the techniques that we use. But there's a threshold to everything, and sometimes the threshold gets surpassed, and it could come from, social, environmental, peer pressure could be one, as you've mentioned, a kid being bullied. I mean, no matter how good a kid's eyes move, if a kid is being bullied every day by 4 or 5 other kids, yeah, that's going to have to be dealt with. Like, no amount of the work that we do is going to fix that, So it is multifaceted. I totally agree.
Yeah, I guess, the question I would have too is like, how do you, and I have so many things I want to get to, so I can't spend too long on this, but like with things being multifactorial, and I think about this sometimes even too, and I'd be curious with your thoughts on this, is it's easy, I think it can even be trendy just to say, neurology, like you get like in my YouTube sidebar, it's like neurologist says this, and it's just like, they appeal to that, like it's like the ultimate authority, like that type of thing. And so I'm just like, my thought is, well, what part of this is actual neurological like software, that the software is the thing, and there are exercises for that software, versus something that is more psychological and requires, a psychological approach, maybe like a therapist, or you know what I'm saying, like something in that nature. So But I'm sure that's a very complex answer. I think you have to be able to test the neurological, right? And then you shore that up. Okay, this checks out or it doesn't or whatever. And then, so maybe it is something that's a different issue. I guess there's no easy answer to that, huh?
I do think you have to test the neurology and improve that before you start digging in someone's head. Because if you look at the order in which the nervous system developed, and it's the nervous system that manages emotional life. But the first task of a nervous system is to connect sensory input to motor output. Like that's its most fundamental premise. So if you wire that properly, now I still think we all need to shrink. Honestly, I mean that. But there might be a little bit less work for the shrink to do if the primary parts of our nervous system work better. But one doesn't exclude the other. And in the cases of pathology, like psychiatric disorders, you most definitely need a medical intervention. But at the same time, and I've seen this with patients that are diagnosed with different mental health conditions, they tend to do a whole lot better after they've learned how to crawl. And they'll still need the psychiatrist and they still might need the medication, but are they ever more stable in their day-to-day? It's fascinating to see. So I think I think we need to improve what we can improve. And what Jeff and I do is so simple, it's so non-invasive, it's so conducive that I'm kind of thinking, and obviously it's our bias because that's what we do, but we're thinking, geez, everyone should benefit from this. And then if they need other things, we're just going to help everyone in what they do. Like we're going to help the shrink, we're going to help the strength coach, we're going to help the high school teacher. We're really going to help absolutely everyone just by doing what should have been done, which is that brain connecting properly to 600 muscles.
On the level of supplements, Lost Empire Herbs has been my go-to for the last 5 years. As someone who's constantly observing nature in motion to help me understand movement better, so too do I draw from nature in my supplementation regime. If you want to check out some of my favorite supplements for energy, strength, and enhancing the total impact of your training regimen, things such as Shilajit, which has been well recommended by many strength coaches, the Phoenix Formula, which was my original Lost Empire Herbs supplement that really made me a believer in the power of herbalism, things like pine pollen, mushroom tinctures, and more, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can use the code JOEL15, that's JOEL15 for 15% off your order. Definitely check out Lost Empire Herbs. They're an awesome company and will really help that total aspect of your performance training process. It makes me think about too, like, you know, like the mind and the body and the body and the mind. You're not going to get one without the, like, and just
100%.
Just from the most purely general perspective, just the impact of just physically moving your body. You go for a walk, you feel better. Kids play sports, it has a positive impact on their lives. And so there's, you know, it just, to me, it is intriguing to think of, you know, the multifaceted impacts of, let's say you have like a one-sidedness in your vision or something like that. You know, it's interesting to consider that. So maybe let's, I'd love to get a little bit more into like some of the main, like the primary, like 101 basic things to test. Crawling is one I think we can all talk about with a pretty fair, like a lot of people, a lot of coaches listening to the show, a lot of people do things in the space of bodyweight training, crawling. You had mentioned like athletes who come up and maybe they started walking, they were rushed to start walking or something like that, or they were a bum shuffler or whatever, which I would have never cared. If you had asked me this 8 years ago, because my daughter is 7 now, I would not have cared at all, probably. But like, you know, then you start having kids and you watch how kids move. And even with what you were saying with the one-sidedness and the left and right side, you know, in soccer, my 5-year-old son's soccer practice, we'll do Simon Says, and I'll say, Simon Says, kick the ball with your left foot. Half of them, 3/4 of them don't even know what their left foot is. So I'm like, well, maybe that's a constraint that rules out any sort of, you know, finding out anything about this. You know, I have to go and be like, this is your left foot. But once you know what your left and right foot is, can you do it? Like I think you kind of take those things for granted sometimes, but it is interesting to see how that paints a little bit bigger picture. And it also gets me thinking, and I don't want to go on a rabbit trail, and maybe we could actually, this may be a good question to shore up right away though, is how many people who I would imagine, and again, you guys have so much broader of I just see a few things and try to make connections in my head. But it would strike me that people who reach like a college level, a pro level in their sport, very likely have a lot less neurological compromises than someone who made it to they didn't make it past JV or something like that? Or do you think differently? I am curious what your take is on that.
Go for it, Jeff.
Man, that's a loaded question. I don't know. I wouldn't say maybe, I don't know. I don't want to give any like certainties because it all really depends on the
Sure.
person. I don't know if someone who makes it to a college level has less. I really don't. I think they maybe just did better than with what they have, than some that maybe have the same things. And as you know, especially Joel, with all the podcasts you've done on motor learning and play, like what I love what Rafe Kelly talks about with rough housing and all that stuff. I think there's a lot more that goes into athleticism and kids that make it higher levels than kids that don't. But I don't know, man. I've seen a lot of professionals have one-sided pains that have chronic things. I mean, when the average lifespan of an NFL running back is 2 years, and injuries is a main cause for a lot of that. For that number, I don't know. It's hard for me to make that argument that they have less. And again, a lot of good athletes, them, you can correlate or fall on maybe on that ADHD side of things, and kids that had more dyslexic side, which gives them gifts. They struggle in certain things, but that now they have gifts. And does that mean we shouldn't work on the lower side of the brain, or the pyramid side, that maybe didn't get developed as much? To me, I think they still should, because I want to help them as a person, not just as an athlete. I want to help them as an overall person. So I don't know. That's hard for me to make that claim either way. When Dr. Melillo, and Matt, you might know the numbers better, has done studies showing that 70 to 80% of people still have retained primitive reflexes. I think that's all something that should go into it. And I know that's not necessarily being looked at with brain injuries. Some people are, some people aren't. But I think that plays into it with. I think it all, like you said, with the psychiatry and this psychology and the brain stuff, I think it all ties together, with pros that have anxiety, or young kids that have anxiety or learning issues and have this. I think it's all related. So I don't know, man. I think it's a higher number than we'd like to think, but I'll leave it at that, Matt.
I think that athletes have probably learned to compensate better with maybe the same imbalances that others didn't. I would also like to think that maybe they have less of these imbalances, just because mathematically it would make sense. I'm not in touch with that many athletes. I wanted Jeff to answer that question. He runs a facility where kids train every day. I'm an osteopath. I do things that are more clinical. I do see athletes, but I don't actually train them, so I don't have as much of that perspective. But that being said, if I look at France, who won the World Cup in soccer a few years ago, the controversy there, funny enough, was that a lot of the players that helped France win didn't grow up in France, and they grew up in countries where motor development came more easily, less industrialized countries where essentially kids are left to themselves a bit more. Now these guys are allowed to represent themselves and stand up for France and wave the flag. That's a matter of identity, and that's fine. But it was just interesting to see that France won, but the players, they weren't born and raised in Paris. So does that play a role? Most likely. What we do between 0 to 2 years old affects how we do a lot of things later on in life, and there is some good research on that. Dr. Melillo brings it up in his courses. So,
quick case study. I became friends with a gentleman who's an Olympic bobsledder that contacted me on social media, and he tore the labrum in his hip. Olympic level bobsledder tore the labrum in his hip, and we did an online postural assessment with some of this stuff, and lo and behold, left eye didn't turn in, left foot flatter than the right, more sensitivity to his left foot, things like that. So, and he's an Olympic caliber athlete. So, I think he just learned to compensate. Oh, and his vestibular system is off, which is crazy. did not have great Rombergs, and which is crazy because he's a bobsledder and he's going 100 some miles an hour. But I don't know. Again, I've just seen it where I think they just do better with it personally.
Yeah, something I'd like to get into some like nuts and bolts in the back half of this show. And as I mentioned, crawling is, I think, really fundamental. Things to maybe from a reflex perspective, what to look for in crawling, ways to do crawl-based work if someone, let's say they became a walker, maybe they were in a walker when they were a kid and they didn't get enough crawling or whatever, maybe they didn't roll enough. Things to look for, and then ways to implement crawl-based activities that can help restore some of these things.
Go for it, Jeff.
Oh, geez. My biased opinion is we'd have to start a little lower in the pyramid than the crawling part. Sorry, Matt. I hope that appeases you, though. Yeah. So we would do some tactile stuff. So Matt, I see him playing with his neuro spike ball right there. One of the first things all my clients do, adults or kids, take off their shoes and socks, and they roll out their feet. They roll out their hands. So we try to get some tactile sensitivity right off the bat. And I'm sure, Joel, you've done that enough because I see you love training barefoot. Some people just don't like doing it. They don't like taking off their shoes and socks. They have some problems with that. And I'm willing to bet there's a tactile reason why they do that. We do that, and then the vestibular system's got to be developed in there a bit. So we do some kind of balance work. And there's other things that we would go through a little bit before the crawling, but I want to make sure if when we get to the point where it's crawling that it's done symmetrical, that we can do it in a multitude of forward and back. I teach side crawling and stuff like that, but there's things in the pyramid before crawling comes in. Hopefully Matt can attest to that, and I made him happy with that answer.
Crawling is very fundamental and important, but basically, if you look at what happens between 0 to 12 months of age, crawling comes, and in industrialized countries, around 7-8 months, we're pretty happy if a kid starts crawling 6 months of age. If it looks like decent crawling, in less industrialized countries, kids start crawling much earlier, and even before the crawling, just rhythmic movements where the kid, let's say, is lying on his back and just swinging his body for what seems to be no good apparent reason. That actually comes before, and those are what we can call rhythmic movements, which we're quite fond of with the stuff that I've learned and that I now teach. But so movement for no other reason than just to move, right? With no purpose of wanting to go from point A to point B. That's actually the very beginning of motor learning. And just to make it freakier, that actually starts happening in utero. So when we look at movement proficiency now, I think where Jeff and I and a bunch of people we've trained are coming from is we say, okay, we're all for assessing a squat. Like I do that every day. Jeff even more so than I do. But then if we want to figure out why it doesn't look the way we would want, it's just a matter of like, where does the headspace go? And where a lot of people's headspace is going right now is they'll think about, a tight hamstring or inhibited glute. And we actually agree that you'll find all these things. But at some point, I guess in our development, we started thinking, okay, so, but why? And then the fact that people sit or stand too much wasn't satisfactory for us, or but they do too much of this sport or too much of that sport, or the right-handed or the left-handed. Like it essentially really has to do with how you've picked up movement as a skill, and some of those movements develop and get quite perfected even before we're born. So again, just learning about these things and having tools to and test things and exercises that we can do for it has a huge impact on how we do very complex tasks on 2 feet. So that's the idea. But yeah, moving just for moving, which I don't think we have much respect for, right? Because we're always like, okay, well, we move for a purpose. Kid lies on his back at like 2 months of age and just wiggles his body around, and that might look funny, but that's actually a really important part of them connecting with their body so that they can then be consequential when they start crawling. But so those are called rhythmic movements. And if people look it up online, they'll find something called rhythmic movement training. RMT. And there's courses on that kind of stuff available all through the US, and it's like super accessible stuff to everyone.
Yeah, that's why breakdancing was so good for me athletically when I was a senior in high school. Rhythmic, ground-based movement.
100%.
It is so funny too. Like the things you watch human beings do that they are not coached to do or not conditioned to do, you can learn so much. Be it children, kids rolling on the ground, or like you said, doing rhythmic activities, and it's like, why are they doing this? Or elite athletes, the nuances of an elite athlete, or especially an elite athlete who wasn't coached to do something, they just do it. I think there's a lot of power with that. I was going to say too, I was thinking about this, Jeff, when you were talking, it's just fun. To me, I find this interesting is like something like foam rolling. Like, foam rolling comes along, people do it, it feels good, but then it's like, well, that's not actually getting out the knot in your, fascia or whatever. Well, no, it's not actually, but it feels good. Like, why does it feel good? Well, because it just increases the sensation, probably does some other things too, but like, it's that sensory, whatever you're doing. I mean, there's a million and one things. Even, it's just funny. When I was at Cal, the basketball strength coach, or one of the basketball strength coaches this is when the Theraguns were getting popular, the little machine gun percussion thing. And of course, as soon as I see it, before I use it, my mind instantly is like, oh, that's the stupidest thing in the world. Like, it's just another gimmick. And then I use it and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. Like, that feels really good. Like, there's something to this. That's pretty cool. And long story short is I think I have found that I don't look at all that stuff in the same light. I don't look at it like, oh, what's the exact little physiological piece? I'm like, it gets blood flowing more likely than not, and it increases sensation and feedback. And honestly, that's like the 80% of the 80-20, I feel like, as long as you're getting those. And even like rolling, like Tim Anderson has been on the show, Original Strength, talking about just rolling on the ground, like in the transverse plane. I remember Connor Harris was talking about just giving people more points of contact. One thing that was really cool I did recently, Jeff, you mentioned Rafe Kelly. I was at not the retreat, a workshop in Virginia, or North Carolina, back about a month ago with Aaron Cantor. And in his warm up, I love this warm up. It was awesome. We did like a lot of like kind of Tai Chi type movements, like just like basic like bouncing or shaking. And then a lot of like percussive, like take your fists and like gently kind of, just hit around muscles and stuff. Or you could like take your hands and rub your arms and your calves and your legs and and honestly, it's crazy. After I did that warm up, and then, the other one was roll on the ground, practice falling and rolling on the ground in random ways for 5 minutes. And I did this warm up and I was like, man, that was like, it just from the sense of usually you warm up and it's like, do this exercise, and sensation is like the last thing. That was a warm up that was completely like, sensation was like 3/4 of the whole thing, but you are moving your body in all these different ways. And I just think, long story short, is every year I go through this, I just believe more and more that sensation is so underrated. And it doesn't have to be, I think you can be more nuanced with it for sure, but I think on a very baseline level, like a very base human level, just something that gets the nerve receptors going and has pressure and whatnot, I think is really valuable. So just doing that, and then, leading into the next piece. Do you guys have any feedback on that? Because I was going to ask you a little bit more about the crawl piece, but I'd be curious about any other feedback there. Because the sensation is something I've been thinking about an awful lot.
I love that stuff. Kind of the Ido Portal and the evolve move play stuff. I love that stuff. I've been incorporating more and more into my practice with me personally, and then what I do with my adults and athletes. I love that stuff. But just giving more awareness to the athletes, to their body, and how they can or cannot do something, or get proprioception. The more aware of things we can get them, I love it.
If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height, or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's PLYOMAT.net. Yeah. I'll just do one other question on the awareness. So feet, balance, and like you had the spiky ball. And I find this is something interesting to me. Matt, I would love your thoughts on this. is I've found I really enjoy like Marv Marunovich Sports Science Lab, like the PVC pipes, the discs. Absolutely love that stuff. I found that compared to something like weightlifting, where somebody who has never lifted before, maybe their bench press is 95 pounds when they start and they're in high school. And then, I mean, they could get up to 150 or something by the end of the year. They could improve a ton. But I find, at least in my experience, someone who's, let's say, arbitrary number, 2 out of 10 ability in balancing on the pipes, they suck, they fall off very quickly. They're not going to go, in my experience, it is very difficult to get them to an 8 out of 10. Like there is these barriers that seem to be this, I mean, they might get to a 4 or a 5, and they might get a lot bit more strength and general ability, definite improvements across. I've gotten so much out of those tools, but for some reason, I do find the improvement curve is just not what it is in other things for a lot of that stuff. And I'd be curious what you guys' take on that.
I think your starting point for balance was already way too difficult for most of the people that we see. And I think that's the reason why they don't improve. So what I've developed with, the IP method, and I had a hard time calling it a method for so many years because I thought it was almost arrogant. Oh, I teach a method. But funny enough, it always was. And I think that's okay to say. It's a system where if you assess a human being in terms of a competency like balance, you basically get to see what they're able to do now. And it's a starting point in terms of where you want them to go. So the exercise that you're describing for me is actually what I would call a stage 3 or a stage 4 activity. Whereas, for instance, just being able to stand with their feet touching, arms across their chest and their eyes closed, which is a basic Romberg, that would be a stage 2. And them being able to lie on their back, move their knees, which would make their head move, which integrates these reflexes that Jeff has been bringing up, like the Moro reflex, so that's a stage 1. So you see, if let's say they have a hard time just wiggling their body when they're lying on their back, that's actually where I would start to turn on the vestibular, the balance system, and then it's a very logical approach. I mean, then I would get them, standing, and then once they're really good at standing on a very stable surface, and we compromise their balance with foot positioning, then that concludes stage 2. Then we move on to stage 3. So we go from static balance to dynamic balance. So I think often enough, we start with tasks that we figure are, accessible because, we think, how come someone can't do that? Whereas with the bench press, we're quick to say, just work with the bar, right? So just work with 45. And then because the starting point is accessible, we're quickly benching 95. And as you've mentioned, Joel, by the end of the year, especially a growing, teenager and who's got more testosterone in his body daily, naturally occurring, obviously by the end of the year, he's doing 135. But I think it's the starting point. I think we have to be more considerate of how messed up some people are or how little proficiency they have in specific, very primary skills. It's quite humbling, even as Jeff was mentioning, even with an Olympic bobsledder, to think that when he would perform static balance exercises, it was difficult. So it's quite humbling when you look at when you look at where people are starting from. And for us, that's the whole thing. It's like we figure out where you're at now, and we want to build, a tougher, more competent human being. So we do it step by step.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I will say I have it just in my still accelerated levels. I'll do like Sports Science Lab discs, which are not too bad. I have these other ones, these big red ones that are almost impossible. But for me, I can do them easily. So then that trips my mind. You'd be like, oh, why shouldn't everyone be able to do these? But I'll do them on like turf, and it's like that's like level 1. But still, what I was going to say is for people who struggle with those foot-based progressions, who are at the lower levels, is it for them? It's probably not, or almost most certainly not, just a skin of the foot issue, not just an ankle issue. It is also deeply rooted in their vestibular system, and like that's where, or likely, or vision. So for those people who really struggle, would it be helpful, like you said, like doing like just standing on the ground, not on something like that's imbalanced, but with your eyes closed, or maybe I guess like head nods or something that would get out of vestibular challenge. So basically, people who really struggle, a better place would be to spend more time with something like that instead of trying to, I call it circus hacks sometimes, because you can make those discs circus hacks. Sometimes if I'm bored, I'll warm up with those, but I don't really prescribe that stuff. But So you would say that?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Joel. Yeah, I just thought I literally yesterday had a case study that ties in what I think you're asking. Doing an advanced Romberg with this one boy. He had his right foot back, left foot forward, eyes closed. He stood there for a minute like a statue, no problem. As soon as he put his left foot behind, he was shaking and rocking and rolling, couldn't stand for more than 20 seconds. So what I had him do was roll out his foot with a narrow spike ball. We tested the canals, and I ended up just spinning him in a chair like 6 times with his eyes closed. Once he got on dizzy, stood back up, left foot behind right, closed his eyes, and he stood there for a statue for a minute, no problem. But yeah, so the skin of the feet and the vestibular system all correlate to that, and that Matt can talk more with that, and then how it could deal with a divergent eye on that side, and
yeah, that might be a little bit. That might be a little bit much for the time we have left.
Yeah,
be a fun conversation though. Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, all this stuff. It's like just a tip of an iceberg conversation for the time we have. But it's cool to think about generalities, like because for me, like I do a lot of types of training in that. And it's like trying to find someone who is that low level. It's like, yes, I have some tools to get you to where I need you to be, but what if you could get more if you did some vision and vestibular challenges and saw that part of the system? It's not just, and I think that's just in general, we live in a bubble until we find a new bubble. And it's like, oh, okay, well, how do I integrate this new bubble? How do I integrate this new bubble? Just back to crawling though. So you mentioned sensation, Jeff. I think I've heard you talk about different types of crawls with like more side bending, or almost like, we talk about like lizard crawls, different types of things in relation to reflex. I'd be curious, just quickly, as we're kind of winding down, some of the links, if we are putting more tactile, more sensory in the system, but then also working crawls in a way that might be a little bit more reflexive. Any take there?
I think that actually be a good question for Matty, because I mean, that's pretty much what he does with the IP method with his stages of development. So Matt, if you don't mind answering that one, buddy.
I mean, in terms of just the order of choosing different exercises. So first off, I mean, we need to make sure that the person feels both of their feet. So that can be, yes, we can do some tactile stimulation, but the other third of that story would be, let's say that in infancy, you were really good at turning your head to the right, not so much turning your head to the left. Typically, if you don't have as much rotation to the left, if let's say we just stick to that one thing, you would typically not be able to recruit your left foot nearly as much. So the capacity to crawl then with your left foot then would have to do with how much sensory stimulation you got on the foot itself, but it can also have to do with, was your head rotation pattern pretty adequate and symmetrical. And then vision. So you had to look straight ahead. If one of your eyes was a bit lazier, as it is the case with 80% of people, typically on that side, it's harder to recruit muscles. So you can have that foot that's a little bit off with crawling, which then leads to that foot being off with gait and then with running. And it could come from 3 different boxes, which are all sensory stimulation. We then like to go and check each of these boxes and see how well they work. And if they don't work so well initially, we stimulate these things in isolation so that we can know, okay, if I just stimulate the skin of the foot, what does that do? Okay, that helps. Okay, we need to do that. What if I make you turn your head to the left repeatedly? Does that make you better? Oh, God, yeah, the left foot is much more stable. Okay, let's add some visual. So basically, we have a checks and balance system for absolutely everything we do. It's one of the reasons why I think we're pretty confident presenting this to you or anyone else. It's not that we think we have the answer to everything. It's just that we do know when we have an answer for something, because we're going to be checking before and after. I most definitely, in most cases, check with each client each of the 3 exercises I'm going to give them. I don't give more than 3 exercises. It won't take them more than 5 minutes because it needs to be manageable. They won't need a partner to do them. All they'll need is the little spiky ball. They might need an RX pad when they get really advanced. I personally stick to just those 2 pieces of equipment, but then I also expect that they would do what I ask because it's made very accessible. So we go from simple to complex, and no stone is left unturned as much as what we know. And again, we check for every intervention to see if there's a positive impact, which would be either gain in range of motion, active, either gain in stability or just that we improve a pattern like a squat or, running mechanics. Things just need to look more fluid, easier, and stronger, faster, and more powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. In closing this out too, kind of taking that from what you were just talking about, Matt, with more of the clinical edge of things, and Jeff more in the the sports performance athletic realm. I'm curious, Jeff, where do you kind of have buckets or, like triage, like we're talking about, like testing, retesting? Do you have kind of like a triage, Jeff, where you're like, okay, this person needs a lot more help from more of these neurological based exercises versus, hey, this person's pretty good? Do you have different levels where you're like not really testing anybody or clients that you're testing more regularly? Like, how does that look for you, Jeff, in an athletic performance setting where people may come in with different levels of function or need and those types of things?
Well, my practice has kind of grown into two separate entities. So I have the sports performance realm, and then I have now kind of the neurological development realm with kids who are labeled with something. Neurodivergent is one of the popular phrases now for kids who have dyslexic or ADHD or autism, whatever. So I do the IP and some of the Melillo method. But with the athletes, to be honest with you, we just kind of start with level one with what Matt teaches with some of the rocking movements and rolling out the feet. And it takes, again, we do 2 to 3 exercises every warm up, and it takes 5 minutes. When I start seeing some of the things that we mentioned before, kids that struggle with knowing right from left, kids that struggle with proprioception and knowing how to bend their spine or just where their body is in space, that's when I start going into testing more of the IP stuff. But I don't really have like a test day when they first come in and this is what we do. And I go through my checks and balances. It's more kind of like case by case. For instance, I had a 13-year-old girl come in for volleyball. Dad wanted me to improve her vertical jump and her lateral movement. I noticed right off the bat that she, from a postural standpoint, had shoulders and eyes and ears that were slanted in one direction, and that she could not look at me when we were talking. I'm like, all right, well, there's some bigger things going on than just improving vertical jump and lateral movement. So that's where I started right at the bottom and gave her homework with all that stuff. And then we started seeing improvements in flexibility, improvements in just cognitive, her ability to remember things, and deal with stress, because she would get stressed out with these tryouts for volleyball clubs and stuff like that. And she would report, and her parents would report back that she was able to take it off better than she used to in the past. Whether difficult, but sorry, to tie it back to answer your question, I test when I feel I need it. I have a really high level track runner right now that we're struggling with her acceleration, particularly with her retraction and where her foot lands and this and that. And I don't know. It just, she strikes me as someone that does maybe have some proprioceptive issues. So we went to level 1 and started doing some of the level 1 stuff with IP, and yeah, she struggled.
Yeah.
She struggled with everything on the lower half. She struggled with the sensitivity of her feet. She struggled being able to rock and coordinate her body. She struggled knowing what her feet are in relation to her lower legs and stuff like that. So boom, we start doing that. She improves really fast because she's a really high level athlete, very, very springy nervous system. And boom, all of a sudden her mechanics and everything and her sprinting starts going better. Now I can't just say A equals B, but I believe that has something to do with it.
Yeah. So I'm going to just ask you guys a combo question I know we got to get out of here. Time's running out, but one, just, what I mentioned, it's almost like we have the layers, right? Like base layers could be the easiest thing. If people are listening to this, what's something I can get out of this? Well, sensation, and you mentioned rocking, like total base layers. And then as you learn more, you find more situations you need to learn more. Maybe you guys just briefly tell me about like the rocking piece, and then where they can learn more. So I know you have, there's an IP course. So if you guys want to talk about that real quick, and then we can get out of here for the day.
Jeff?
I'm sorry. I learned IP during COVID because Dan Fichter told me to take this course from this really smart guy. And that kind of blew my mind and opened my world to just some different stuff. And then when Matt does a great job of citing where he learns information from. So that's, I think, a lost art to a lot of people out there. They don't tend to cite where they gained their knowledge and stuff. And so just how I learn, I started tracking those people. from Dr. Melillo to the rhythmic movements courses. I started taking those, and that started just exploding and really opening up the rabbit holes more to things in my practice and what I do. So I would first implore, and I would say this not just because Matt's on this call, but IP is you have to have an open mind, and I know that's hard for some people because it is different, and you're gonna be like, why the hell am I doing this rocking? Why am I doing this weird shit? Because I know I was one of them, and I had those thoughts when I first started doing it. But then when you start learning the why, and Matt does a great job of really detailing the neuroscience, it makes a shit ton of sense. So I would implore everyone to look into that first.
And thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And I really do like saying where I've learned stuff from, because what I really enjoy is people learning more and having discussions with these people. And quite frankly, what I enjoy the most out of traveling to teach is meeting people that come from different places. They've taken different courses. There's contents courses that exist in Europe that don't exist in America, and the opposite is also true. So just learning from these people what they've been influenced by, and I try to bring that into one package where, again, as Jeff says, I'll always tell you where I've learned even a single exercise. If it's not mine, I'll tell you this comes from Paul Chek, or this comes from, and then it's depending on people's interest, to dig where they want to dig. But if you're interested in stuff that I teach, the website is expertise. So that's X and then PERTISE 360.com. That's the promotional company that Dan and I work with for Canada and the US. So everything's on that website in terms of the stuff that we teach, that Jeff took everything I've been teaching. So I thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that from you.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. Just last 30 seconds, rocking different than crawling, just rocking like bear rocking back and forth, or a 30-second definition.
Can I send him some videos, Matt? Is that cool?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's going to be.
Okay, so maybe you can post it to your show notes, Joel, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Is that cool?
Yeah.
It's hard to describe, but I'll send you some videos that show it.
All right, yeah, sounds good. They'll be on the show notes on Just Fly Sports, so everyone listening, head on there to check it out. So anyways, thank you guys. I know we got to get off the call here, so we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Jeff.
Later,
I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.